Thank you for being here with me and welcome back. My name is Catherine Daniels, and I love to empower people with spiritual healing and wellness. And the best gift about Retreat to Peace is the gift of inner peace, greater love, and joy. During these times of changes and uncertainty in our world, nothing is permanent except our souls. And that's why we need to come together as we travel through one another's countries, creating a bridge, removing all the labels. And as we come together as one people, finding our home in one world, this is why our signature talk today is so important. Today, I am so excited to welcome my dear friend, Stephanie Duesing. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I'm so thrilled to be a guest on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. You're so welcome. And I have to be honest with you. I am so excited for this conversation because this is so necessary and needed. And to all of my listeners to Retreat to Peace, I just have to tell you that we're embarking into territory that most people have never heard of. So I hope that you will just hang with us and listen to the entire show because this is going to be a ride that you haven't experienced quite yet. And I think there's somebody out there that you may know that may be touched by this. So Stephanie, if you could, for the audience that's listening right now, just share a little bit about who you are.
Well, thank you. So I'm a music teacher, and I happen to make a major medical discovery in the field of visual neuroplasticity. I'm an author, speaker, and international advocate for people who have something called cerebral/cortical visual impairment, or CVI. CVI was identified as the number one cause of visual impairment in the developed world more than 10 years ago, and it still doesn't have a diagnostic code. There's recent research showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom have symptoms of CVI, making CVI more prevalent than autism, which means that here in the United States, we have got millions of students in our classrooms going undiagnosed with a common visual impairment. So my son, Sebastian, when I talked about how I made a major medical discovery, I'd like to talk a little bit about my son. His name is Sebastian. He is the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally, which means that he quite literally sees with words, just like a bat sees with sound. Sebastian spent 6 hours in the fMRI for the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at Scheppen's Eye Research Institute. Dr. Lotfi Merabet, who is the director of the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity and associate scientist at Massachusetts Eye and Ear, and associate professor of ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School, captured Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision in the fMRI and published a paper about it in the journal Neurobiologia about a year and a half ago, in collaboration with Dr. Barry Cran, who is the head of optometrics at the New England Eye Low Vision Clinic at the Perkins School for the Blind. So this is a true story. This actually happened to our family.
That is so much to take in, Stephanie. I mean, I can't even imagine what this must have been like for you with your journey, with your family, with Sebastian. I mean, there's so much, so much. So if we could just take a quick step back, because you just put a lot out there for us. And I'm thinking that there's probably a couple people like myself that's trying to process. She just said that it's kind of like how bats use sound, right? Your son is using, say that piece again, because I don't want to get it wrong.
Thank you. Yes, this is something that had never been heard of before. It's a totally new discovery in the field of visual neuroplasticity. My son sees with words, just like a bat sees with sound. And to help everyone to understand, I'd like to take a minute to talk about Daniel Kish. Daniel Kish is a real person. He lost both eyes to cancer in infancy, and he taught himself how to echolocate, just like a dolphin or a whale or a bat. Daniel has no eyes, but he can ride a bike. Daniel has no eyes, but he can describe complex visual scenes. You can take Daniel somewhere he's never ever been, and he can tell you exactly what he sees around him. And so the reason I talk about Daniel is because we know now that humans don't even need eyes to see. Daniel doesn't have eyes and he can see. And in fact, when scientists put Daniel in an fMRI, which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging system, they discovered that his visual cortex lights up and is active when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds. And so he is quite literally seeing with echoes, just like a bat or a whale. So just like Daniel has unique visual processing, my son Sebastian also has unique visual processing, but my son sees with words. And so my son uses verbal compensation. And what he does is he has memorized this enormous list of how we describe how things look verbally. My son has memorized all these things, and he has to literally think those descriptor words to get a momentary glimpse of what things look like. So my characteristics before I had cataract surgery 2 years ago, I used to wear glasses all the time. And my son told me that my characteristics were tall, blonde glasses. And when my son thinks those words to himself, he literally gets a momentary glimpse of what I look like. It's just a flash. It's just like, in his words, he says he just gets an idea of it and then it's gone. There's no retention in visual memory. It's just a flash of understanding and then it's gone. And so Sebastian has to do this all day long to identify every object and person and thing that he encounters all day. And in fact, Sebastian is the only person in the world known to be able to choose to see or not see with his eyes wide open. When Sebastian isn't thinking the verbal descriptors of how things look to himself, he actually has no conscious perception of sight at all. He's completely blind. And in fact, we know that Sebastian actually spends most of his waking hours with his vision off, even though his eyes are open, because Sebastian, one of the reasons that I'm here today is to talk about what I think is one of the biggest tragedies of our time. And that is the fact that our medical and scientific communities failed to recognize deaf blindness as a spectrum disorder. So my son not only has cerebral/cortical visual impairment, or CVI, which is a brain-based vision impairment, he also has a condition called central auditory processing disorder, or CAPD. And those two things together, if you can imagine trying to listen to a physics lecture and learn about physics, and to watch the professor and to look at the equations up on the board, and all the time you were trying to do that, you had to have the silent stream of narration in your head going on so that you could see what was going on. So, for example, imagine you had to silently recite the Declaration of Independence to yourself while you were listening to a physics lecture. You probably wouldn't get a lot out of the lecture, right? So my son has to constantly have this narration of facts about what's around him in order to see it. And so while he's doing that, it's very hard for him to listen and to hear. So according to my son, what he says is when he's trying to see, he's seeing as well as he's able to. And we know it's very minimal. He has almost no vision whatsoever. He is actually blind. He's just got this tiny, tiny little bit of vision. And then in order to hear as well as he's able to, he has to turn off that internal narration so that he can focus on what's being said. And so he really literally cannot see as well as he's able to or hear as well as he's able to at the same time. And so that puts my son, in my opinion, on the deaf-blind spectrum. Mm-hmm. And this is an enormous problem because, as we talked about earlier, we have 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom with symptoms of CVI. We believe that the vast majority of people who have CVI, or at least the majority of them, also have CAPD. They also have auditory processing disorder. And so we have this huge, huge issue of kids going undiagnosed with sensory processing disorders that affect their ability to hear, that affect their ability to listen, their ability to see. And so that's why I'm so grateful to be here today. Thank you so much for having me on your show so that we can talk about these issues.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And it is my pleasure to put you in this space to allow exposure, because when you told me 1 in 30 kids are affected by this, I immediately was like, oh my gosh, that is a very large number.
It is.
Very large. So that's, I mean, here in the US, we have on average, I don't know, 20, 25 students in a classroom. So you're basically saying one student out of every one or two classrooms has this. And most parents probably don't even have any idea. And that's what I want to ask you, because I feel like we have to kind of pull back to go forward. So let's pull back a little bit, Stephanie. And if you could share with us a little bit about your testimony, like how did this start? How did this get started?
So in January of 2017, we were going through old photos. My son Sebastian was a straight A honor student. He's a genius artist who draws and paints with almost photographic realism when he wants to. He's extremely athletic. He played on the water polo team in his high school, and he was also on the diving team. He was very musical. He sang in choir. He played trombone. When he was little, he played soccer and t-ball. He was in gymnastics and dance. We had absolutely no idea that my blind son had any disability of any kind at all. And so I want to be really clear here. CVI can be an entirely invisible disability. There is no way to tell from looking at my son that he is almost entirely blind. You cannot tell academically, you can't tell socially, and you cannot tell physically. So we literally figured it out by accident. We happened to be going through old photos. And I am that mom who made my son a baby book and then decided I'm totally not crafty and I never wanted to do that again, ever.
Is that the scrapbooking days when everybody was scrapbooking and there were scrapbooking parties and you used to sleep over in a hotel and scrapbook like crazy? Is that what you're talking about?
I just could not. No. So yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And I couldn't do it. And so I made my son a baby book and then I quit. And I have, I think, $1,500 worth of scrapbooking equipment in my closet behind me, which has never been used again. So he has a $1,500 baby book. And then fast forward like 15 years, and now my kid is a straight A honor student and he's on the water polo team, and we have no idea there's anything wrong. And we happen to be going through old photos that we hadn't looked at in years. And you have to remember, my son is an only child. So we were sitting here looking at pictures of him at his face on the computer. And we were starting at the baby pictures. And I was narrating to my son about who was in the pictures because our family spread all over. And there was a lot of people he wouldn't necessarily remember because we don't see them regularly. So I was saying things like, oh, look, there you are with your cousins from Canada. And oh, look, there you are with our neighbors from the house we lived in when you were a baby, you know. And then after about half an hour of looking at his own face, we'd kind of migrated up into the toddler preschool years. And a really cute picture of my son showed up on the screen. And I said, oh, look, who's that? And there were crickets. And finally he said, how should I know? And I just looked at him. All the hair on my neck stood up. I was like, what do you mean? How should you know? That's you. And you have to remember in 2017, I had never heard of CVI.
Right.
I had never heard of face blindness. The technical term for that is prosopagnosia, or face blindness. It's the inability to recognize faces, which is a common symptom of CVI. And so I had no idea it was possible for a human being to be face blind in 2017. So I was just astonished. And so I said, that's you. And he said to me, if you say so. Wow. Completely convinced. So I'm like, well, this is completely not typical. And I started quizzing him about other people in the pictures. Myself, my husband, 15 years younger, thinner, less gray hair, but still obvious. Right? And he was guessing, not knowing. And so that really threw me because I'm like, how can my kid who can draw and paint faces and everything else that interests him with photographic realism not recognize our faces, right? So this mystified me. It was very close to bedtime. Everybody else went to bed. I had to solve the mystery, right? So I was on my phone. There was so little factual information about CVI that I could find in 2017. It took several hours before I found the right combination of search words before I managed to find prosopagnosia. And what I learned in 2017 actually was wrong. In 2017, what I found on the web doctor or whatever, it said that prosopagnosia or face blindness was very, very rare. Well, actually, we just had the New York Times run an article a few months ago stating that 1 in 30 people have prosopagnosia. 1 in 30. So this is a very common symptom of a common visual impairment, but I didn't know that in 2017. All I knew was that it was real, and I was astonished that this could even happen to someone. I didn't know anything about it, but I wasn't scared. I was more curious. But the very next day, we discovered that Sebastian had taught himself to navigate by counting his steps and turns, and had been navigating our own home that way, and our small neighborhood, and his extremely architecturally complex school. And that's when I got scared, because my son was a straight A honor student. He had plans to go off to school in the city of Chicago. And there was no way that I could safely let him, now once I understood how severe his vision actually was, that he couldn't recognize his surroundings and he was navigating by counting his steps and turns, I couldn't send him off to Chicago without getting serious help for orientation and mobility, which is what you give to a blind person to teach them how to navigate independently. And so I knew that the only way that Sebastian could qualify for orientation and mobility training was with a doctor's diagnosis. And so the very next day at 9 o'clock, I made a phone call to Sebastian's neuropsychologist, who had just completed a full neuropsych evaluation on Sebastian for a completely unrelated concussion that has nothing to do with the CBI. But I mean, who knew Sebastian and had just seen him, right? And I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from that very first appointment. And that doctor said, I can't help you, and I don't know anyone who can. Good luck with that. And he dropped us.
That's devastating.
It was. I was terrified.
And honestly, I mean, there's so many things that you said in that whole excerpt there that is just devastating on so many levels. Like, as a mom, I'm a mom. I can't even imagine what that would feel like the moment that you recognize that he wasn't connecting basic things like the pictures or navigating through your house or, these different moments. I mean, how did that affect you as a mother?
It was so incredibly devastating. I had to tell my 15-year-old son that he was blind. And we were literally just a few days before talking about what kind of car we were going to buy him for his graduation gift. And we were literally just getting ready to enroll my blind son in driver's ed. And we almost enrolled him in driver's ed blind and not knowing.
Literally.
Right. Yeah. We didn't know. And so he didn't know he was blind. And it's very important for your listeners to know that all people who are born with CVI, they don't know that they have CVI because they've never seen with a brain that sees. They don't know. They assume that you see what they see.
Right.
They don't know that they're missing anything. And so they cannot tell you that there's something wrong with their vision because they don't know there's something wrong with their vision because they've never seen with a typical brain. And so
Stephanie, like your basic, it sounds like your defining moment with Sebastian, as you said, was sitting on the couch, looking at this photograph and then talking about who is this and who are these people in these other photographs. It sounded like that was your defining moment. Would you say that was, or was there another defining moment that kind of highlighted things for you?
That was an important moment, but the first time I truly ever saw my son and understood who he was the day we figured out he was navigating by counting his steps and turns. That's the day that I realized he was blind. And that was devastating because I felt like our lives blew up. I felt like our lives were a jigsaw puzzle, and everything I thought I knew about my son just blew up, and it assembled in a completely different jigsaw puzzle that was unfamiliar. And it was so terrifying because overnight we went from being what we thought were just the very lucky parents of a very gifted student to suddenly not knowing if my son could ever live independently. I didn't
Right.
know if my son could learn to navigate by using technology. I didn't know if he had that ability. I didn't know if he would ever be able to leave our home. And I knew that would be devastating to him because he's extremely, extremely ambitious, extremely academically able. And he had plans like all 15-year-old boys. He didn't want to live with mom for the rest of his life. He
Right.
was going to go off to school, right? And so this was devastating. And to discover, imagine being a 15-year-old boy and discovering that you're probably never going to drive. I mean, there's no
Well,
way.
well, there's so many things because as they're teenagers, I mean, they're exploring a brand new world because they're on the threshold of going into adulthood and experimenting those boundaries of adulthood, the independence. And as you said, just being able to drive a car and giving them the opportunity to have the keys and go off and drive a car. I mean, thankfully, you were able to recognize this and identify this before you got to that place. But on some level, did he ever know within himself that he wouldn't be able to drive a car? Like, was that something he recognized?
He didn't know he was blind. He didn't know his vision was any different. And in fact, when we talked about how he had taught himself to count his steps and turns, his answer was he assumed that everybody did that.
Right,
He
right,
thought that was because that's what he did. He thought that's what everyone was doing. But he did tell me that he always was aware that he, in his own words, was much more freaked out about going places than everyone around him was. And he had no idea why.
right,
Because it is terrifying to be blind and to have absolutely no one around you know that you're blind and do absolutely nothing to help you. And I want to be very clear for your listeners what happened to my son going undiagnosed until the age of 15. This happens all the time. I have a dear friend in Iceland who was 26 when she was diagnosed. She's legally blind. She lived for 26 years not knowing that she's blind. I have another dear friend. Her daughter, they discovered she's blind when she was 12, just last year. So
so
this was not just something weird that happened to our family. This happens every day in the US because there's no diagnostic code for CVI and the doctors get no training in what it is or how to diagnose it. And so people who have CVI are routinely misdiagnosed with autism, behavioral disorders, emotional disorders, and intellectual disabilities. And so they are labeled as everything else except what they actually are, which is blind and visually impaired. And it's a
right.
tragedy and it needs to change. And I'm so grateful to be here. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to try to, expand upon some of your experience because I'm thinking about myself. Like, if I have children at home or teenagers at home, what are some of the things that people can look for in their child or their teenager to help them understand if this is, if they're 1 in 15 that would have this?
Mhm. That's a wonderful question. So there's a lot of wonderful resources that parents who are wondering about CVI can go to, and I'm going to talk about those first. The first one I would suggest, if anybody's wondering if their child might be misdiagnosed with autism or something else, a behavioral disorder or an intellectual disability, but you've always suspected there was just something odd about their vision. Maybe they seemed like they were clumsy. Maybe they just really couldn't handle going places like the grocery store or to the big box store, and this just overwhelmed them and they just freaked out for no reason that you can see, right? But maybe they look like they're typically sighted, but their behavior indicates that maybe they're very stressed out in crowds, right? These are all things that might be signals. And so I would highly suggest that people go to cviscotland.com. It's cviscotland.com. It is considered by experts to be one of the best sources of factual, medically correct information about CVI. They have actual videos where you can see what it might look like through the brain of someone who has CVI, what their vision is like. And you have to remember that every single person who has CVI is different, right? So you can't watch one video and think, oh, I know how all CVI people see, right? CVI is caused by brain damage, and that can be fairly random where it happens. And so, as Dr. Gordon Dutton, who's one of the best experts in CVI, says, if you've met one person with CVI, you have met one person with CVI, right? Everybody's a little different. So each person's unique. But as far as our own experience goes, I can say that the only real symptoms that we had that there might be something wrong with Sebastian was what appeared to be mild anxiety that did not make sense compared to our comparatively boring and ordinary life, right? So what we saw when Sebastian was about 2.5, he started to express anxiety about going places, visually complex places like the grocery store. If you've ever seen the children's book, Where's Waldo? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do, yes.
And you have to find the little guy in that really crowded scene, right? So visual complexity is a common symptom of CVI. It's caused by damage to the dorsal stream of visual processing, which is what goes up the back of the head. And so looking at something like Where's Waldo can actually be physically uncomfortable and even nauseating for people who have CVI. That's a very common symptom. And so people who have that symptom have difficulty finding a face in a crowd. They might have difficulty picking out their shoes from a pile by the door. Children who have CVI and have difficulties with visual crowding might find it impossible to find a specific toy in a toy box full of toys, right? That crowded scene. And so one of the common symptoms of CVI is fear of going to visually complex areas like the grocery store. Picture the cereal aisle with all of those boxes of cereal, everything different, right? That's just visually overwhelming for someone who has dorsal stream impairment. And so when Sebastian was 2.5, he was extremely bright and very verbal, and he started to express fears about going to the grocery store and to his gymnastic class. And he called it, and these were his words, the I'm nervous game. He called it a game. And so I didn't know like how upset he was because he was calling it a game. And he'd say, I'm going to play the I'm nervous game in the car. And I'd be like, what's the I'm nervous game? You know, and then we get in the car and he'd say, I'm nervous. And I'd be like, why are you nervous? Because I didn't know. And he'd say, I don't know, but I'm nervous. And he would do this all the way to the grocery store or all the way to gymnastics class. And it was so mystifying because he didn't know he was blind. He didn't know why he was scared to go somewhere, right? He couldn't tell me that he was blind, but he knew it was scary to go somewhere blind and have nobody around him know that he was blind. So, and another common symptom of CVI is something called looming. And that's because people who have CVI, they often have some parts of their vision that might be working fairly typically. Like, for example, for my son has face blindness, which we talked about already. So he has no ability to recognize faces. And that is processed in the right fusiform gyrus of the brain. So if you take your right hand and you touch above and behind your right ear, that's where the right fusiform gyrus of the brain is. So if you have damage to that part of your brain, you can lose your ability to recognize faces. Your ability to recognize places is processed very near to that. And so people who have face blindness very often also have another common symptom of CVI called topographical agnosia. And that's an inability to recognize your surroundings, your environments. People who have topographical agnosia cannot form visual memories of visual landmarks. So that means every time you walk into your own home or your own bedroom or your own classroom, nothing ever looks familiar, because your brain is not recording visual memories of your surroundings. So Sebastian has prosopagnosia or face blindness. He also has topographical agnosia. He also has something called object agnosia. So he can't recognize objects either. And he also cannot recognize biological forms. So in addition to not being able to recognize his own face or anybody else's, He also can't recognize his hands, face, body, animal parts, animals, things like that for anybody or anything. And so the only things that my blind son can recognize like a neurotypical person can are words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes. And the reason he can see those things like a typical person are is because the parts of his brain that are involved in recognizing words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes didn't get damaged when he was born. And so he has visual access to numeracy and literacy. We literally just won the lucky lottery of CVI. It was nothing that we did. He just got lucky. And so my blind son was a straight A honor student because he can read. And so he passed every vision test every single year because, as is common for many people who have CVI, my son has normal acuity. Our optometric exams are just decades out of date. They're only measuring acuity and like color blindness, and they're not fully encompassing what we actually know the full range of what vision is. And so this happens all the time. People who have CVI are routinely accused of faking their blindness because they go to the eye doctor, they just measure their acuity. They say, well, your acuity is fine, and they don't account for CVI, which can affect your ability to recognize faces, places, objects, biological forms, words, letters, numbers, simple shapes, the whole gamut of everything. And as we said, each person with CVI is unique. And so it's a very big problem. So to circle back to what you were asking about Sebastian, and you were saying, help me, remind me here where we're at.
Well, just, asking the question of how do you identify if you're 1 in 30? Like, how can parents, I guess, kind of, field whether or not there may be a possibility of this in their child?
Thank you. Thanks for bringing me back. So I wanted to be really clear. The reason I told those stories is because just because your child is academically able doesn't mean they don't have CVI. My son was a straight A honor student. He's off at college now. He's a straight A honor student at college and has been on the dean's list every semester. And he's still blind. And he still can see words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes and nothing else, pretty much, right? So, yeah. So being academically able does not mean that you have normal vision. Also, passing a normal optometric exam and having normal acuity does not mean you don't have CVI. It's common. So the things to look for in our case were like the symptoms of anxiety, going to the grocery store, being afraid of going to a visually complex place. We also noticed when Sebastian was in preschool, my son experienced what appeared to be mostly mild separation anxiety at preschool. He cried every day at drop-off for 2 years of preschool, and it was a complete mystery because my son was very socially adept. He was good at making friends. His very best friend was in his class with him, who he absolutely adored. He loved his teacher. He was extremely advanced academically, and he loved to read and paint and draw. He loved all the toys. It made absolutely no sense why my social, gifted, fun, well-adjusted child cried at drop-off. It made no sense. And so when I raised that question with his teachers and his doctor, it was brushed under the carpet because he was social and he was academic and he appeared to be fine. And I was told, some kids just do that. We worry about the ones who can't settle down. Well, my son always settled down. And what he learned at a very young age was that telling grown-ups that you're scared doesn't help. He did not outgrow his fear. He just stopped talking about it. And he internalized it. And he remained just as scared because he was just as blind, but he just stopped talking about it because nobody understood what was wrong. When he was in 3rd grade, he had an IQ test done because Sebastian actually always scored in the 99th percentile in both math and English on both on all standardized testing without any preparation whatsoever. And so he actually finished the 4th grade math book first quarter of 3rd grade without assistance. We didn't even know he'd done it until his teacher came running out of the building right before Christmas to tell me, without a coat on, and it was like 20 degrees outside. And she told me that they wanted to advance him a grade because, in her words, they could not meet his needs academically in the grade he was in. Okay, this was a big surprise to me. I mean, we knew he was smart, but I didn't know he'd finished the book. And so we actually fought the grade promotion for social reasons, and it turned out to be the least bad of the 3 options we were given by our school. And for us, it actually was a wonderful thing for Sebastian. But we didn't seek it out. It just turned out to be the least bad option for a very, very gifted student. And the reason I talk about this is because if you know anything about the grade promotion process in the United States, they look at every aspect of your child's development academically, socially, physically, psychologically. They look at everything.
Yeah.
My blind son sailed through the grade promotion process without raising a single red flag. Nobody knew. Not a single person.
Isn't that interesting?
And the reason I also talk about this is because part of the grade promotion process was to get an IQ test done. And this was one of the many times that my son was misdiagnosed, because when he had the IQ test done, my son, who had finished the 4th grade math book first quarter of 3rd grade without help, my son, who was scoring in the 99th percentile on all math and English standardized tests without preparation, scored in the very top on the language part of the IQ test, at the very top. And then there was more than a 20-point gap between his language score and his visual spatial score. And I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, and to me, I've always believed that the visual spatial score was tied with math ability. And so I asked the medical professional who gave him the IQ test, well, what does this mean? Because he's scoring in the 99th percentile on language, and yet he's down at just above average, right, in visual spatial. And here's my kid who finished the 4th grade math book first quarter of 3rd grade, and he's scoring in the 99th percentile without help. And this doctor didn't know anything about CVI. And I didn't know anything about CVI. And so she just said, he's not as smart as you think he is. That's
wow.
What she should have said was, maybe he has a problem with visual spatial processing and he should be evaluated for CVI. But that's not what happened.
Well, CVI is not on the radar.
No, she didn't know.
Right.
So she just said he's not as smart as you think he is. And I'm like, I think he is as smart as I think he is, because he is excelling ahead of everybody else in every subject, right? With no effort on his part. I mean, he's never needed help, right? In anything.
Well, I think that's like, you're bringing up a good point, because a lot of times as parents, we're able to pick up on things that other people cannot pick up on. And one of the things you said early on is, as soon as you recognize that something was not quite right, you started researching like crazy because you wanted to find the answer and get to the bottom of it. And I think a lot of times as parents, we have to be our child's advocate. So to your point, it's like, you're the one that's with your child. You're the one who knows your child better than anybody else. And sometimes we have to go to great lengths and do things to advocate for our child. And, to your point, just bringing awareness to this could be a possibility of something that you don't know about. And just, the fact that this is the way he tested doesn't necessarily mean that there's not something else going on. Just because it's a flat, like, this is the test, right?
Exactly. And you're so perceptive for bringing that up, because we were repeatedly told by the best medical experts in the US that there was no possible way that my son could have any form of neurological visual impairment, because he was above average on visual spatial, which meant that he had average vision. And they would not take into account that he was skyrocketing high in his verbal, and that his extremely good verbal scores were allowing him to compensate, which is exactly what he does, My son's visual world is like, if you can imagine being out in an ocean and it's extremely foggy and there's just nothing but this colorful swirls of fog. You can't see anything else ever, except every once in a while a sign floats by and it might say Walmart or Home Depot, something like that. It's not attached. You can't see the building. You just see the sign, right? And it floats by. And once it floats past, it's gone. And you have no idea where it went because you didn't see the tree by the building. You didn't see the building. You can't see the road, right? You can't see any of it. Just the words float by and they're not attached to any solid object that you can recognize. That's what my son's visual world is like. And he has to literally guess who and what every single person is around him by their verbal characteristics. And he is such an incredibly good guesser that he passes for typically sighted. He has literally memorized the verbal characteristics of millions of objects, people, celebrities. He just knows he identifies things by how we describe them, right? So if he's in the garage and he comes across an orange round thing with black stripes, I mean, he uses logic. He's like, that's probably a basketball. He's using logic. He knows he's in the garage. He can smell the car, right? Like, and he's using logic everywhere, right? If he finds an orange round thing in the fridge, it's probably an orange, right? Like,
right.
Yeah.
So how does he communicate on a day-to-day basis? I mean, I'm sure at home his communication style is probably different than when he's out on campus or among strangers, that kind of thing.
I wouldn't say so. No, he's extremely bright and verbal and articulate. And
so his verbal cues and everything, that's all there. He picks up on it. He just speaks like we speak. There's no...
Oh, you would never know.
Yeah.
If you met my blind son in a coffee shop and didn't know who he was, you would never know he was blind.
Yeah.
You would never tell. And I want to be really clear with your listeners. There's a lot of myths about CVI. One of the myths about CVI is that all children who have CVI don't make eye contact. And that, I'll be honest, it is a symptom of CVI, not making eye contact. You can see why people get misdiagnosed with autism, right? Because they don't make eye contact. But the reality is we have photo after photo after photo of my blind son who can't recognize his face or anybody else's, making regular, consistent eye contact from his earliest days. So that's just a myth. My son's always made easy, regular, consistent eye contact. Yeah. There's another myth about CVI where it's a big one. They say all people who have CVI can't use visual guidance of reach, which is where you look at something and then you reach for it. We have photos of my son using visual guidance of reach at a developmentally appropriate age. He had all normal developmental milestones. My son took the training wheels off his bike when he was 4. He's been riding around our neighborhood ever since, almost completely blind.
Wow. I mean, like, as you said earlier, it's different for each person who has this. So I can understand that. So it could be the way that your son is gifted may be different than another person. But I think the key thing here is just getting people to expand that there is, this out there, and that this potentially could be something that someone they know, or maybe their own child has something like this or something similar to it. I mean, it's just opening up different doors. Go
ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I had, when my children were young, I had a unique opportunity where one of my friends, her daughter, actually was displaying some signs early on of a lot of anxiety and stress in social settings. You could tell there was giftedness because, similar to your son, she could draw these beautiful, amazing pictures at an age that you wouldn't expect that from her, right? It was very well advanced. And later she was diagnosed with autism. But I think that's the thing, that there's so much mystery around autism. It's almost like there's so much to autism that we can't really say this, this is exactly what it is. But then there's also this mystery of what caused it. Like, how did this happen? And I think there's just so many things that parents are wrestling with right now when it comes to their children, because it just seems that, I mean, when we were younger, we didn't have this kind of thing, right? We didn't hear about these kinds of things. And I don't know if that's because of advancement in medical and technology, where it wasn't present because we didn't have the knowledge of it, or if it just wasn't present. So it just really kind of highlights we're in this new space and arena, but this is why advocating and getting this message out to the entire world as we're doing right now is so important. So, so important.
Thank you. And I want to say, I think you're exactly right. We actually do know why we have so many people who have CVI now. And it's because the improvements in our NICU care, it's just increased exponentially. And so now we have all these teeny tiny preemies who did not used to survive, who now actually do survive, thankfully. But they're born so tiny that they often have brain bleeds. And so these tiny preemies often have cerebral palsy, they often have epilepsy, and they often have CVI. Those three things often go together. So we were very, very lucky that the only thing my son came out of it with was the CVI and the auditory processing disorder. He has both of those, but he didn't get the cerebral palsy. He didn't get the epilepsy, but those things tend to go together. That's very common. And
so sorry to interrupt you, Stephanie. Was Sebastian, was he preemie in the NICU?
No, actually, he was not a preemie. Sebastian was born full term. And
okay.
3 days before I was due, I was diagnosed with preeclampsia, and I went straight to the hospital where I was induced, and I coded from the epidural. My blood pressure crashed to 40/26, and I received the 6-inch needle of epinephrine to the heart. I was unconscious for 6 hours of my labor. And when I woke up, the nurse was pressing on my stomach saying, "Do you feel a contraction?" And I was paralyzed from the chest down and I couldn't feel anything. And a few hours later, we were told, my husband was there the whole time, and he says that there was no fetal distress, so I did not have an emergency C-section, but I had a normal vaginal birth. But then my son had a 9 on his APGAR score, a 9, and I took him home from the hospital believing I had a perfectly healthy baby. But I want to be really clear, I'm an early childhood music and movement specialist. There are more than 2 decades of research demonstrating that high quality music and movement experiences before the age of 7 have tremendous neurological benefits, including better balance, coordination, proprioception, which is knowledge of where your body is in space, which comes in handy when you can't see your own body, auditory discrimination, language development, reading and math ability, IQ, fine and gross motor skills. I mean, all of it. So there's more than 2 decades of research demonstrating that the brains of musicians are actually different from non-musicians, because we know that music is the only activity known to science that activates the auditory, motor, and vision cortices of the brain at the same time. It's the only activity known to do that. And the reason that's important is it forces both sides of the brain to work together through the corpus callosum in the center. And so musicians have more and better connections between the right and left sides of their brain. And that's why all of these things work better for musicians. And Sebastian received intensive music and movement therapy from birth just by accident of having me for a mother, because I think that singing and dancing with my baby is fun. And so I didn't realize that he'd had a stroke. I treated him like he was healthy. And when I was happy, I danced with him and twirled him around and bounced him on my knee. And we did lullabies and rocking and finger plays and body awareness rhymes and everything throughout the day, every day. And Sebastian had all normal developmental milestones. And so one of the reasons that I do this is to tell parents, especially parents of newborn babies, you need to be singing and dancing and moving with your child throughout the day, every day. We as a society are awash in children with sensory processing disorders because they are strapped into bouncy chairs and strapped into strollers and they cannot move. All human societies use music and movement as part of their early childhood development because music and movement are necessary for normal human brain development. That's why all human societies sing and dance, because we need it as people to develop healthy brains.
I love that you're bringing this up because if you listen to the show on an ongoing basis, I'm always promoting how music is so therapeutic and it does so much for the body just to lift and elevate you out of a mood. If you're like in the slumps and you put your happy music on, it's the fastest way to elevate you out of that slump space into a higher vibrational space. And it just changes the chemistry of the body. And there's so many benefits to it. And the beautiful thing about Sebastian and having you for his mom is that this is what you did and this is what you do. And you were giving him such a profound gift and you had no idea you were doing that. And it's just so beautiful how that all unfolded the way that it did. And it's a testimony to you, Stephanie. It's a testimony to everything that you bring, love and light, and just bringing that to other children besides your own, because it is really beautiful. And I'm so glad that you shared this piece with the audience, because I know they've done studies on pregnant women and, just having been exposed to some sort of traumatic event, how that sits in the body, how it sits in the cellular structure of the body. So the music, the movement, that releases it out of the cellular structure. It releases it from the body. It allows the body to heal and to heal from the inside out. So it's just profound. And I can't even imagine where Sebastian would be right now if he didn't have you for a mom.
Thank you for saying that. I'm really touched. Thank you.
Yeah.
Because, there's actual research showing that music in hospitals reduces the amount of pain medications that patients need. So they actually are using it in hospitals as part of therapy to reduce pain medication, to reduce stress, because there's actual research showing that it works. Music is so important. And in addition to music, I'd also like to talk about the art piece. We know that my blind son quite literally taught himself to see with art. My son taught himself to memorize all the verbal characteristics of how we describe how things look by drawing, painting, and sculpting them starting when he was very, very young. He was obsessed with art from the time he was a little baby, and I used to let him paint on his, he was just starting to walk and he wanted to paint, and I put it on the, what do you call that thing that holds the paper? Sorry.
The easel. Yeah.
Thank you. I had a stroke when Sebastian was born as well. And so sometimes common words don't come to me quickly. So the easel, and he would paint one picture on the easel and then he would immediately start painting on his own skin. I could not keep him from doing that. And so I would just plunk him in the bathtub, take all his clothes off and let him paint.
Aww.
And I am quite sure that I'm not an art therapist, so I don't have the right words to describe this, but the dual sensory nature for a blind child who can see color and movement, my son can see color and movement and words, letters, numbers, simple shapes. He would paint the skin like on his arms, and to feel the movement of the paintbrush and the texture of the paint and see the movement of the color. Even though he couldn't see his own arm, he could see the movement of the paint going up and down and the color of it. I am quite certain that this was very therapeutic for my son.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's beautiful. Stephanie, I know we're at time, but I am just so filled with gratitude for you sharing this incredible journey that you've had with Sebastian. You're a beautiful soul and human and mother. And I just know that this is going to be taken so far and wide, and what you're doing and advocating for Sebastian. I mean, I can't even imagine how many lives you've just touched. And I just am so profoundly grateful. And I do have one last question for you. I ask all of my guests on the show, if I were to pick up your earth angel feather off the ground, what would your message to the world be?
My message to the world would be kind and inclusive of everyone, because we have a real problem with labeling people incorrectly based on what we see and not based on what's actually reality. We only see a veneer. We don't.
That is, yeah, that is, I have chills. I have chills. In this moment, in this point in time in history, Stephanie, it couldn't have been more perfect. And I applaud you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Immense gratitude. So much gratitude. So for all of my Retreat to Peace guests that have been listening, I hope that you take this and share this with your friends, with your family, anybody you know that might benefit from learning about Stephanie and Sebastian, and just share this far and wide and give it as much exposure as it deserves. And this is Catherine Daniels with Retreat to Peace, as always, asking you to live your authentic life with peace. And we'll see you next time.